Thank you, and good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This webinar is brought to you in partnership by RSA and TUV Rheinland Open Sky. TUV Rheinland is a global leader in independent testing, inspection, and certification for privacy, security, and safety. We have a long heritage of protecting consumers from the risks associated with emerging technology, allowing organizations and industries to thrive and innovate in a trustworthy manner. I'm Mark Coder. We're going to be discussing quantification of digital risk for business and economic gain today. The latest chapter in my own digital risk management career is directing TUV Rheinland's Center of Excellence for Mastering Risk and Compliance. That includes strategic service development in many areas that support digital risk management, today's topic. But my risk journey started over 10 years ago when I became Chief Security Architect in a large healthcare organization. I reported to the Chief Technology Officer and focused on cost-effective strategy, innovation research, business solution governance, and IT risk management for the enterprise portfolio. In that role, I found it necessary to blueprint, launch, and direct the organization's GRC program to rationalize cybersecurity spend, initiative timing, and requirements. As a result, I was included in the organization's annual pursuit of cyber insurance coverage and even helped reduce insurance costs. The first book I read on my path was the now dog-eared IT risk book that you see on the left, Turning Business Threats into Competitive Advantage by Westerman and Hunter. It prepared me for the cultural aspects of transforming IT risk management in my organization. And the most recent, Measuring and Managing Information Risk, co-authored by Jack Freund and Jack Jones. Jack Jones launched something called FAIR back when I started my journey, and I immediately did my best to practice it. Today we'll be sharing approaches to give you insights on prioritization and the touch points with cyber insurance. And now to my co-hosts, starting with Marshall Tabiran.
Thanks, Mark. I started my career primarily as an internal auditor with stints in all facets of auditing, from financial, regulatory compliance, fiduciary, and information technology and security. Eventually, this led to the chief audit executive role at a couple of different bank holding companies. From that position, I moved over to the second line of defense as an operational risk manager, and finally to director of enterprise risk management. My responsibilities while running the ERM group, among other things, included information security and the purchase of appropriate insurance coverage. One of the things we will cover today is how cyber risk quantification can help you make good decisions about the scope and limits of insurance you should consider. Anyhow, from my ERM role, I went to work for RSA Archer to help provide input on solution development, marketing, and working with customers on establishing risk management best practices, particularly in the areas of enterprise and operational risk management and third-party governance. It's very nice to be able to talk with you today.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Pattison, and I joined RSA Archer's Risk Transformation Office as an executive director a year ago. My earliest work in risk management was in the manufacturing and logistics industries, building operational contingency plans and third-party risk management software. Over the past decade, I've been working with the RSA Archer product to improve risk management across multiple domains, including information security, internal audit, compliance, and physical security. Most recently, after reading up on DevOps Phoenix project, I feel that things have come full circle as manufacturing concepts around lean process improvement and the theory of constraints are now entering the software development and risk management arenas. I've also spent the last 3 years examining how organizations can better identify risk and improve the efficiency of their security spend. Digging into Doug Hubbard's work on risk measurement provided insights on how we can improve our approach and use mathematically sound models to better quantify risk. As we open the discussion today, let's examine what we're up against a little bit closer. Much of what is on this slide should not be news to any of us as we examine the threat landscape. The key here is to realize that the scale and scope of the various threats is driving us to examine new approaches. In most cases, organizations will need to adjust their security posture and likely will need to justify additional funding. Let's have a look at a couple of these examples. botnet strength at 90 gigabits per second, and more recently, I've even seen attacks exceeding full terabyte as adversaries attempt to steal credentials from various websites. With the IT explosion, we've all had our business partners request to connect more devices and business processes to the internet, expanding the overall risk surface. At 200 regulatory changes a day, the financial industry is going to need to look at new forms of machine learning and automation to evaluate the onslaught of these regulatory changes. Our adversaries also no longer feel the need to hide in the shadowy corners of the dark web. They collaborate openly on platforms like Facebook, often selling malware as a commodity for as low as $40 a kit. As our businesses drive through their digital transformation, departments are signing up for new cloud services. In the recent SkyHigh report, average enterprises have up to 1,400 services in use. And while all this is going on, the success rate of our adversaries penetrating our organizations continues to rise. In the past, these challenges were mainly top of mind for financial institutions and consumer retail sites, the traditional targets of organized retail crime, but this is changing. June of last year marked a dramatic change for all organizations. In September's publication, Andy Greenberg from Wired took a look back and authored a very detailed look NotPetya looked like as it overtook European organizations and operations. If you're not familiar with the depth of this ransomware infection, it's a good place to start to see what it was like behind the scenes. From the beginning, Jim Snabe of Moeller Maersk has been very open about their experience, describing it in detail during the World Economic Forum's review of data cybersecurity. His hope is to educate and inform other organizations of the significant and far-reaching impact of the event. During the forum, he goes on to describe the scale and scope of the event. With over 500 locations impacted, the cost of $200 to $300 million in lost revenue recovery, 4,000 servers, 45,000 PCs, and 2,500 applications had to be recovered. Jim warns during this talk that while they were able to recover through some extremely resilient acts of his team members doing 6 months of work in 10 days, he is not sure that in the future this will be a sufficient way to respond as they connect ships to the internet and explore autonomous vehicles. What Jim is signaling is that we need to evolve how we evaluate our threats, measure risk, and position our countermeasures. So what exactly was behind this NotPetya threat? NotPetya is believed to be the work of the Russian nation-state team Sandworm, also known as Voodoo Bear and Telebots. Having lived through NotPetya, dealing with Sandworm and its infection felt very much like this image illustrates. Sandworm originally appeared to only be targeting power and utilities, but recently it appears they are more focused on acts of cyber terrorism using the Ukraine as a live-fire cyber range. In the case of NotPetya, the weaponized docs downloads spread further and faster than they had likely anticipated, even infecting some Russian organizations. A Bitcoin stash would have also not been sufficient countermeasure as the ransomware portion of the attack was fake. As a collateral damage from this nation-state-driven infection, Wired was able to estimate and gather these following estimates. For each organization, the totals are in the hundreds of millions, with the White House estimating a total impact of $10 billion. While it's overwhelming, like we saw in the picture, organizations have a choice. Wait till the impact hits your organization head-on, or look to evolve your organization, how your organization will evolve and position itself in light of these new threats. Marshall is going to delve deeper into what the risk environment looks like and how we can shift our thinking and approach.
As Chris's statistics demonstrate, the impact of cybersecurity incidents have become material for a growing number of organizations. Cybersecurity teams are faced with this reality, along with the realities that the attack surface is growing larger every day as organizations enter and expand markets, digitize products and services, and change their business processes. KPMG reported that 91% of CEOs surveyed are personally ready to lead a radical transformation to digitize their businesses. In addition, cyber risk teams are challenged with increasingly capable adversaries, as well as a growing list of new regulatory privacy mandates like GDPR, the California Privacy Act, New York DFS, and PSD2, to name a few. so the demands and pressures placed on cyber risk teams is ever growing. At the same time, finding sufficient qualified security talent is becoming harder. The Wall Street Journal recently reported a shortage of such talent, more than 250,000 shortage here in the U.S. and 1.5 million shortage on a global basis by 2019, and the cost of talent is increasing significantly. The talent shortage is making things harder, as is the need for cyber risk managers to talk the language of business. Cyber risk has become the hot topic, no question about that. In more and more organizations, cyber risk management is converging with operational risk management, and operational risk is merging into enterprise risk management programs. Consequently, cyber risk managers have to be able to express cyber risk as a part of these broader risk management approaches. This impacts their terminology, assessment approach, controls, and reporting. Finally, information security budgets are being approved higher up in the organization. Accenture recently reported that the approval of information security budgets has moved up the stack. In 2017, only 38% of information security budgets were approved by executives or the board of directors. In 2018, 59% of information security budgets were being approved by the executive team or board, a huge shift. The bottom line is that cyber risk management teams have to learn how to do more with less and to understand and articulate their problems in terms that the rest of the business understands. They have to be able to prioritize based on risk and provide business justification for where security investments need to be made, including the purchase of insurance to transfer the risk from cyber incidents. With these challenges, cyber risk management practices have been maturing over time. The history of cyber risk management for most organizations has been following this kind of journey depicted on this slide. Initially, much effort was focused on ad hoc developments, new products and services, and responding to incidents. As organizations began to try and get in front of incidents and be more proactive, they began trying to identify, document, and manage their risk, most of the time using spreadsheets and SharePoint sites. Lists of risks, threat sources, and vulnerabilities were all part of this cataloging process. In most organizations, the sheer scope of potential cyber risks make it impractical to manage in Excel. As organizations embraced holistic risk management, there has been pressure to report cyber risk in the same manner as the rest of the organization. This typically meant reporting risks via a risk register that could be depicted in the typical 5x5 heat map that you see here. But for most organizations, the heat map is a deficient means of communicating cyber risk. So we are beginning to see the emergence of cyber risk quantification within the industry, a more actuarial approach to cyber risk assessment.
There's a long way to go on risk management. Here's some stories that Marshall, Chris, and I see from the field all the time. How do you make decisions on security investments? Gaps in controls without context, by monitoring the threat landscape, typically without a data model for associating threats to risks, though. Audit punishment, we all have that challenge. But do only their findings matter? What about other findings and incident lessons learned? Where do they fit? And of course, with many new CSO roles to be filled, the mentoring challenge of someone else's strategy. But that may not be the best fit for the target organization. How do you select your key controls and evaluate the effectiveness of those controls? Key controls, aren't they all important? Oh, the Sarbanes-Oxley controls. No, not just those. The functional leaders duke it out, everyone with their own bias from budget needs and hard lessons learned, but no data. We let internal audit determine effectiveness, but that's not really fair to audit. They aren't living with the day-to-day operational threat indicators that risk managers should be aware of. Is there a preferred risk management framework? We're hoping to hear things like NIST 830, ISO 27005, or better yet, ISO 31000. What do we tend to hear? NIST Cybersecurity Framework, ISO 27000, COBIT. Well, those frameworks cover a lot of territory, including chartering the security program in the Office of the CISO, governance, voluminous control libraries, which tend to become the focus. They all mention risk, but that tends to get lost in the weeds. Oh, and that little cube, like Marshall said, it doesn't do nearly enough to rationalize costs and key controls, not in the modern, rapidly evolving world of cyber threat and digital transformation. So let's talk about what it takes to make this happen, to solve these problems. Think about the day-to-day decisions you make about security and IT risk. The reality is we all need to sleep at night, and by that I mean feeling comfortable with your decisions and how you arrive at those decisions. You should feel confident that you have focus on what's important and line of sight to enabling your business. This counts for management decisions within your span of control, as well as recommendations to other budget managers and stakeholders, including the board and the chief financial officer. As leaders, we must set the stage for risk prioritization and in some cases quantification. Yes, even in security, and that's what converged risk management is all about. 20% of your energy should very well address 80% of the need, the old management rule of thumb. Have you identified your 20%, your focus? If you had a catalog of 300 or so controls, would you focus on all of them equally? Or would you be better off knowing which controls matter the most given the scope of your program or a specific assessment? Now, the key is to look at decisions from two very different perspectives. There's the world of the right, you know it, regulatory frameworks and best practice frameworks. And then there's the world on the left, which is our focus today, business-aligned IT risk management, which considers threats to the assets that underlie your corporate objectives. This culminates into an accepted list of attacks and other disruptions, loss scenarios in a risk register. To determine priorities, you must look to the left more so than the right. The left answers the questions, what can happen, how much do we care, what can be done about it, and how much should it cost? The right answers a different question, and one question, what capabilities should we have? But it does not alone address how, where, and when to use those capabilities. Look, both perspectives are important in their own right and should be equally energized. It's literally like using both sides of your brain to analyze any situation. What's going on? What are my options? So you need to optimize how you manage the right and refocus that conserved energy on the left. Now, the skills are different and the conversations are different on the left, but even the practice of CISM from ISACA says, 1, get to know the business, and 2, determine risks. Then think about controls. By looking at any situation from both sides, you can establish a risk repository and determine prioritized controls, key controls, and the definition of measurable effectiveness for those controls. It's important to get the conversation going with your business leaders. To have effective discussions with the right set of stakeholders, you'll need to establish the scope of your digital risk management program within your operational and enterprise risk universe, especially as they converge. We've seen a surefire way to test the scope clarity between risk domains is to establish the threat profile. This is crucial to establishing loss scenarios anyways, but a threat profile includes the sources, threat actors, and motives and conditions they're operating under. Various threats to the organization, holistically speaking, nature, everything else, business risk, should be addressed across the risk domains, but not duplicated. You don't want to overlap with other risk leaders with budgets, such as legal, regulatory, and compliance that should already be accounting for threats of regulators as an example in lawsuits. But you don't want to underlap either, right? I mean gaps between the programs. Who's accounting for risks associated with using evolving technology, perhaps where best practices are still unclear? Once you start interviewing stakeholders in your scope and talking about threats, you may be surprised how naturally business leaders understand threats without being security risk experts. From the combination of threats and the asset inventory, you'll be able to build a risk register with risk statements that the business can actually rate impact for. Security should not be doing impact analysis, at least not alone. From here, you can start to identify critical controls and security analytics requirements in parallel. We spike out security analytics, by the way, here, specifically because they give you increased threat insight. And we're going to discuss how security analytics supports cyber risk quantification probability a little later in this presentation. Since your analysis started with talking to the business and aligning with business priorities, support for your investments is more likely to happen. Oh, and this is really important. Do not let the Security Program Management Office launch an initiative without carrying forward the risk scenarios that were initially used to justify the project in the first place. Now we're going to walk through a risk register conceptual example, which treats controls as answers, if you'll notice, not risks themselves. We want to focus on how to use controls and the value of doing that, the loss avoidance recognized. That's why inherent and residual risk are looked at separately. It helps with key control identification. Take two risks in modern healthcare. We do a lot of work here. One project may have to consider proportional spend in controls to address both privacy and safety, and in very different targets. A multi-component wireless IoT product versus the public cloud API that services it, for instance. How would you balance these two risks? The threat motives and impacts are quite different, as are the cost of risk treatments. Take time to talk to business leaders and business analysts on risk scenarios. Start with a simple agreed to scale that is aligned with your digital risk taxonomy. Cyber threat intel teams, we're going to talk about likelihood right now in the middle. Cyber threat intel teams who focus on threat means and motives, along with security architects and testers who see weaknesses and opportunities, can rate the likelihood easily given their knowledge in a defined scale as well. And from here, we have organizational wisdom and consensus captured as inherent risk, impact times likelihood. And we haven't even discussed controls yet. We've just covered what's important. Also, when you tie one or more controls into the reduction of risk, a specific risk, you get clarity on the security architecture requirements for true layering of controls, how they work in tandem given a specific attack scenario. Compliance-driven programs claim to layer controls, but they are in disregard to specific scenarios and fail to work in synergy when needed. Without scenarios, there's nothing to design. This is why we view a lack of maturity in IT risk management as a systemic matter, a major driver for why compliant organizations still suffer losses. So organizations must move from the start position, especially as they leverage digital transformation and support it. We have seen numerous benefits to a crawl, walk, run approach. It offers improved decision-making every step of the way. As you mature down this path, you'll articulate with increasing effectiveness the need for resources in terms the executive team can understand and support. You'll also rationalize your own tactical priorities with increasing confidence. Moving from compliance-based risk involves talking to the business about threats and scenarios that keep them up at night, scaling the discussion to be frequent and to establish a prioritization approach. And then with initial prioritization, certain scenarios or sets of scenarios in your risk register will be ripe for financial analysis, cyber risk quantification. Let's talk about process. Process is important for digital risk management maturity. You should be aligning with predominant standards such as ISO 31000, focused on continual improvement and cyclical processes for IT risk. Of particular importance is the documentation of loss scenarios along with your business context, the risk register. Now let's talk about risk monitoring way over to the right, which in modern day needs to be active, not passive. What we mean by that is we no longer have the luxury of assessing a risk and then putting it on the shelf for some predetermined amount of time to look at it later. Remember, we're supposedly monitoring the threat landscape and making decisions, and the threat landscape changes daily, right? We need to be event-driven based on changes in the architecture and threat behavior. This is active risk monitoring, and we'll show you a little bit more about this near the end of the presentation. And last but not least, our topic today, from your processes and information gaining, you'll gain insight on which scenarios to quantify. An example might be a highly rated, unique risk scenario with costly treatment options that are outside your common key controls, the ones that meet your 80-20 rule. Another example may be where safety of your constituents is concerned. How much is the right spend, and when are time and money better directed elsewhere? On your journey to knowing when and where and how to quantify risk, an understanding of proportional value emerges. As soon as you have a risk register with controls identified for risk, you can look at the data from the control perspective. How many risks in the risk register does control 5 in blue treat? And how highly are those risks rated? Consider this qualitative position. We are satisfied with the cost and success of the Control 5 project. It cost so many dollars and addressed risk of 8 points per our approved register. 8 points, what are those? It's the number of risks in your register the control treats, weighted by the inherent level of each risk you've built consensus around, which we showed you previously, all summed up. As you mature, you'll replace this simple point scale with actual annual loss expectancy, financial terms. But even now, it stands to reason that controls to the right should cost less if you're comfortable with your spend on Control 5. And controls to the left may cost more and may be worth it. And that is the start of financial insight and risk tolerance. I also want to mention something else here, though. We've seen the style of critical thinking get people to look at lower cost alternatives. Hey, plan B is better than writing out an exception. And even consider innovative, unconventional controls. You have smart people in your organization. When you establish scenarios and cost caps, they will come up with the most effective approach and improve return on security investments. They'll factor cost as part of the design.
As your organization's program matures into the run stage of maturity that Mark described, you need to improve your risk assessment approach. We believe the better way to assess risk is using cyber risk quantification. CRQ is based on the open source ontology of FAIR, or Factor Analysis of Information Risk. It allows cyber risk teams to assess risk in monetary terms and talk about cyber risk in a manner similar to how the rest of the business talks about risk. It also helps you to prioritize your risks in monetary terms so you know where to allocate scarce resources to do the most good. CRQ produces statistical results that are easy to generate and understand. Results focus on precision, real possibilities, and objectivity versus subjectivity. As such, results are easily supported in discussions with executives, the board of directors, regulators, and insurance underwriters. CRQ produces easy-to-understand graphics such as these that show the financial risk of individual cyber risk scenarios, a ranking of the top cyber risks in monetary terms, the amount each risk scenario has been reduced by the risk treatments that you have put in place. This gives you the ability to assess whether the resources you are spending on protecting against a specific cyber risk scenario is worth it, or whether the resources would be spent better elsewhere. And it can also tell you how much in losses you can expect across your program for the various different scenarios. This information is essential when deciding how much insurance to purchase or how much to set aside in capital reserves to self-insure the information security risks that you may be subject to.
Now, let's take a closer look at FAIR. What you see here is the structure of the framework, the ontology. the inputs and their relationship to each other. FAIR is a very valuable methodology that helps you blend together expert perspectives from different practitioners. Notice the lower left. A huge driver in FAIR probability analysis, or loss event frequency as it's noted here, is threat. This is not a vulnerability or weakness. It's an actor from your threat profile and estimated activity. Ironically, threat intelligence from security operations is available, but typically ignored in top-down risk programs. And there's two issues that cause this persistent silo. One, the security operations function is very busy reacting to events and looking for incidents. It's not like they're not busy. Two, their view of threat is in terms of operational indicators of threat, operational data, indicators of threat, indicators of compromise, which are not directly transferable to threat event frequency, or more specifically, contact frequencies, as you see here in the diagram. It's close in concept, but some alignment of the threat and risk functions is required, and actually quite possible. We're excited to share this capability with you today. To monitor and factor the threat landscape for FAIR probability analysis, you can align security analytics yielding threat reflection, we call it. You've heard of threat detection and practice it in threat response. This is another benefit to cyber threat monitoring. With properly written risk statements to support FAIR analysis, you can convert and deduce analytics by creating attack models, the how aspect of the loss event. Those attack models lay out the steps the attacker or other threat source would take or accidents they may make to make the risk scenario actually occur. And with this in hand, the analytics team can pull the appropriate events from the relevant systems and network logs to piece together evidence of the attack brewing. Don't assume their default sensors cover all your risks. Once those analytics are put in place, meaningful key risk indicators can be returned and reviewing risk and threat activity over time, and should convert it in form of banded metrics. RSA Archer is especially suited for this given its metrics flexibility, its functionality, and built-in threat profile components. The machine learning aspect of security analytics yields meaningful upper and lower bound trends regarding threat activity, and they're learning on the fly. These are perfectly suited for empirical risk modeling inputs like FAIR modeling. You might be asking now why upper and lower bounds are both important. Isn't threat activity going down a good thing? Well, this is what we've seen. While breaking an upper threshold may be signs of an imminent attack, breaking a lower bound of threat activity may actually be signs of a broken detective control or threat actors trying to hide their tracks. Repudiation. We see this occurring in complex system designs with asynchronous event feed mechanisms. Sometimes there's latency, sometimes things stop reporting and need to be restarted. And that gives the threat actor time to sneak in. When key risk indicators break an upper or lower threshold, you can invoke workflow in your GRC. Perhaps email the associated risk owner for awareness so they can decide if they want to change their risk probability. Remember, FAIR benefits from good threat contact inputs, and here you can have it. You can also automate the update of inherent risk probability, or even be creative and retrigger cyber risk quantification. This approach gives you the evidence you need to justify the changes in priorities, or know when that cost-need ratio is close enough to pull the trigger on an investment you've been considering for a while. You want to evaluate those signs of threat frequently so you can make your move before it's too late.
So let me summarize a little bit what's going on with the risk assessment process. All information security teams are being asked to do more with less, and they are having to learn to articulate their problems in terms the business understands. Organizations with maturing information security programs have become more business focused. They have shifted away from solely completing control questionnaires to understanding risk and where controls are actually most needed. That insight also allows them to understand which threats are the most likely and impactful. They are identifying, documenting, and assessing risk consistently. And even though risk is being assessed qualitatively in most cases today, the qualitative assessments provide a directional justification to address technical and organizational control gaps.
When you establish cadence, document digital risks as loss scenarios, integrate threat intelligence, and monitor those KRIs continuously, your digital risk stakeholders will naturally be able to factor the threat landscape and now understand the moving direction of risks. Imagine not only knowing your risks and your top risks, but actually seeing a loss probability rapidly rising week over week, given new threat activity. A sudden change in threat activity overnight can and should shift your remediation priorities. Remember, threat actors are not bound by an annual plan. They shift opportunistically, and so should you. This example in RSA Archer of inherent likelihood direction and that indicator being red, green, blue can be calculated directly from live threat activity. And on to Chris for summary.
Yeah, so we want to leave today's attendees with some take-home messages. The methods and techniques we touched on can be applied to all sectors, regardless of your maturity level. And understanding your threat profile is the first step. This is different than using traditional compliance-based security, but it'll help you better align your organization against the threats that exist. That said, compliance by no means is dead. These approaches simply start to target what parts of compliance align with your greatest threats and then focus your energy there. Taking this financial-based approach to risk quantification helps to justify spend and gives you board-ready reporting. Centralizing and maturing your risk register will also provide valuable inputs to the rest of your security program, including business continuity and incident response. And then the common ontology through FAIR, along with quantifying in dollars, will help risk teams align better with their business partners. And in cases where affordable countermeasures do not exist, these methods will also provide you a basis for risk transfer economics in the form of cyber insurance and other insurance solutions. So next we'll provide you the contact information so that we can continue these discussions. I wanted to thank my two co-presenters, Mark and Marshall, and we will open the floor for questions.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, your question and answer session will now begin. If you'd like to ask an audio question, please key star, then 1 on your telephone. Record your name and press the hash key. If you then decide to withdraw your question, simply key star and 2. All questions will be answered in the order received, and you will be advised when to ask your question. All other lines will remain on listen only. Alternatively, submit a question to us on the WebEx. And to do this, please click on the Q&A tab indicated by a question mark sign. Type your question and click send to all panelists. Just a quick reminder, if you would like to ask an audio question, please key star, then 1 on your telephone, record your name and press the hash key. We do have an audio question, and it comes from the line of
Ed Odenwalder, Top of Asia Capital Partners.
Please go ahead. You're live in the call.
Yes, my question is, do the data services that you described earlier include probability information, or are they is it just frequency information that one could use to divine a parametric model or distribution curve of some sort?
This is Mark. I'll take the first stab at that. We primarily focused on the threat aspects, and the reason why our emphasis is there is because even in organizations that do this very well, very well, this is can be the stickiest wicket for them to estimate. So we're really diving into, let's not let that information around threat activity only be available in the eyes of the SOC operator who may ignore some attack vector because they're dealing with an incident. But that low and slow activity, which might rise over time, it may be lower from an incident management perspective or less suspicious, but it may represent heat on an attack vector that you hadn't considered a priority before. So, short answer is our focus is really on threat in this presentation. However, there is work going on that I've seen around, especially with GRC, the technologies that typically have so much about weaknesses and controls and findings and vulnerability scan data that there's really a ripeness there to be able to pull that into the FAIR model as well, which is the other aspect of probability. It's really threat times weakness. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you did. And then a second question would be the availability of the data services that you described in the presentation.
So what I described to you is in the example of Archer is really just using the risk function and the metrics function and the data feed function. And so from a technology platform perspective, there's nothing and your security analytics platform. These are all things that many people have or are considering.
Great.
Whatever platforms they're on. So it's really using those existing pieces a little bit more creatively, and the most key element of it being information modeling to say, okay, if you're worried about a certain loss scenario, and we look at that and it's written properly for fair analysis, you can turn that into attack models. From attack models, the SOC knows how to build analytics, and really it's a great alignment between business and the SOC, right? The SOC should be aware of scenarios that their default sensors are not going to capture.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, the data sources, if you start to look in data you've been collecting to potentially do forensics, when I've done studies like this in the past, even contact with a call center through social engineering, you can pick up from those various sources good data points that will help you refine the models as you're building out the models in the FAIR framework. And then the key is if you don't have that level of precision that you're looking for, then that either flags you to go look for more empirical data around that or to improve kind of your ability to listen for those issues. So it starts to drive into the factors in the FAIR model that you want to get that deeper precision on.
Great. Thank you, guys. Appreciate the answers.
So, guys, there's an interesting question on the Q&A screen. Let me read it. Do you think the traditional return on security investment calculation is still beneficial in risk management process today?
I think you know my answer to that one, Marshall. You and I talk about that quite a bit. There's different. I've seen people do return on security investment different ways. If you recall the slide I had with the bar chart and the proportional view, if you start off with a risk register that's got a simpler rating mechanism, you could still count up inherent risk points, impact and probability through threat, and not only count how many controls how many risks the control can and should address, but the weighting of those things and sum those up. And that's with a simple scale. That's not rocket science. That's just saying proportionally this control is twice as valuable as this other control, and you can do the bean counting from there. What gets better is if you go through that risk register and identify the risks that you want to quantify. Maybe it's the top 10 risks that give you a good enough representation out of 50, so that's like the 20%, 80-20 rule. And maybe you just quantify those, and you start to get to the dollar factor of how much these things should cost. And it's such an eye-opener when people do that, because then they start looking at it and saying, oh, this control needs to address these 18 risks, and it needs to cost less than this. that's part of the design criteria, and we've seen a lot of good creativity come out of that for return on security investment. It's right-sizing the control as well as being focused on the scenarios that it needs to address.
Yeah, I think I would add to that, Mark, and kind of expand the definition of a security investment. So when you look at risk, regardless of what type it is, from a ISO 31000 perspective, a security investment is a risk treatment. And, there's a bunch of other risk treatments out there. We mentioned insurance for risk transfer. There's hedging of risk and so forth. And so when you look at the broad spectrum of risk treatment, even for security, you're faced with these other possibilities to reduce or transfer the risk or even accept the risk commensurate with your risk appetite. But to do that effectively really requires you to monetize the amount of risk that you have and you would have on a residual basis if you implemented the controls. And so I think what we're advocating here is that the information security profession is mature to the point where they're taking on a more robust assessment process to come up with more precise estimates of the investments that they are making. Would that be fair to say, Mark?
That sounds good. Chris, anything to add on that?
It's important to note too that it's not your traditional kind of linear ROI or one number ROI that you're looking at when you're using cyber risk quantification with FAIR. It is probabilistic distributions, and what it'll spawn inside of an organization and get the business more involved is when you're talking about what is the risk appetite, what can we do to offset that risk, and that's the power I've seen in the framework is as you overlay those control packages, you can actually have those conversations of how much investment against how much risk. So that's important to note that it is the output of a simulation and not just a traditional linear ROI.
Other questions?
We do have another question on the WebEx, and the question is, I also would like to know about cybersecurity economics and open problems in this area, return on security investment, proposed by Roe F.F. Anderson.
So cybersecurity, I'll take the first stab at that. I mean, cybersecurity economics, I think that, right now, everyone's got their differing models in their head of what that might mean to them. An example might be that you're thinking about the economic aspect of your two-factor strategy, and maybe a very specific situation with investment in a key control. And maybe you start off with the simplest form of two-factor to protect your environment. And it may be one-time password, it may be text message, SMS. And you put that in because it does something. It's not perfect, but it may address the risk in an appropriate manner. And you may recognize that a better solution that's more resilient might cost a little bit more than you're ready to spend in a certain situation or a certain time frame. So you might look at that and say, with quantification, I believe I'm reducing the risk this much, monitoring threat activity to make sure my assumptions are accurate, and I'll look at the residual risk and insure the rest of that as an economic trade-off, right? Because you'll buy insurance at a hedge rate proportion, not the actual residual risk. So that's where the hedge rate factor comes in from ERM, ORM. But then if the threat activity changes, you might look at the curve, you rerun your FAIR analysis and say, hey, the situation's worse, it's graver than we thought, residual risk is like this, it's now worth it to buy tokens or whatever your approach may be. And you pull the trigger on making that investment. So what you've done is you've looked at it and said, economically, I put in a low-cost control. monitoring the threat landscape. I'm ensuring the residual just in case that control fails me or threat catches me by surprise. And when the ROI changes per the FAIR analysis, I'll pull the trigger and invest when it's appropriate.
Yeah, and I think also from an investment perspective, it gives you better visibility to control overlap. So, for example, in several discussions I've been in, when it gets into kind of GDPR risk and privacy, that when you start to look at controls around encryption, while I'm improving a set of controls in one area for GDPR, that's actually also improving potentially cybersecurity posture from a confidentiality perspective. So that's where, as you start to load these up, you can actually see better return on investment as you make smarter decisions around how am I addressing those various threats and what the impact actually is to my organization.
The other economic thing that, if you remember the example I gave earlier about, risks in medical devices, I like to use that as an example because the medical device manufacturers, cannot avoid the safety, potential safety ramifications, cybersecurity, and they can't ignore privacy either. So the question is, based on the design, what should they proportionally spend? And the answer shouldn't be 100% on one or the other. It should be split. It should be blended appropriately. In cyber risk quantification, sometimes people look at it and say, well, is it just, are you running a model just to avoid spending the money? It's not about that. It's the economics model is, I'm running the model because that money may be spent or resources may be spent elsewhere. It may be better spent elsewhere. And in the end, it's all about protecting the organization and its constituents. So ethically, you're doing the right thing anyways. I think we have time for maybe one quick question.
Certainly. And our next question, you've mentioned how cyber risk quantification helps with decisions to purchase cyber insurance. What are the benefits?
What's the benefit of purchasing cybersecurity based on a CRQ approach is what Mark's talked through is the FAIR ontology and the process of identifying your cyber scenarios. So as you work through those cyber scenarios and you're quantifying the amount of risk in monetary terms, you're answering two things that are critical in the purchase of insurance. You're answering the question, what should the scope of that insurance be? Do we need to worry about business interruption that results from a cyber incident? Do we need to worry about the theft of assets or intellectual property of the company as a result of a cyber incident? And if so, in monetary terms how much that risk could be to your organization. So you can make a very informed decision, are we going to retain that risk and cover it, out of capital of the organization if it occurs, or is it above our risk appetite and we would prefer to transfer that risk to insurance? So if you make that decision, you know which insurance you should buy and you know the limits of that insurance. Another benefit that's associated with those two things is that if you go out and just purchase cyber insurance, you're going to talk to your broker. They may bring somebody in that's going to ask you a few questions, and they're going to say, well, you may need $10 or $50 million worth of cyber insurance. If you've done this analysis yourself, you can validate that what they're telling you is accurate and relevant to your organization. Otherwise, you're just buying whatever they're trying to sell to you, and you could be spending more money than you should spend given the true amount of risk that you have, or you could be grossly underinsured and be in a very bad state of affairs if the scenario were to, in fact, materialize.
Yeah, I think the 15-second version of that approach might be think of it this way. You get your risk register, you got maybe 100 risks in it. You use a simple mechanism to rough rate them. You look at the SKU and you pick the risks that represent 80% of your overall inherent risk, whatever point scale you're using. Quantify those, and that's the 80-20 rule of really whatever those models add up to as total loss expectancy, then this is something that's material for determination of the right level. And if you do it repetitively and you do it frequently and you show where risk is declining based on your activity and you show that to the brokers, then you're in a position to argue that your rates should be better next year.
Well, I think the other advantage that FAIR gives is that this scenario-based analysis will also help you, and we talked about this yesterday, kind of examine the fine print, right? As you look at what that threat is, what the impact is to your organization, either based on previous events within your organization or, you know, others similar in your industry, it will help you understand kind of what the total coverage is, because in a lot of cases, these insurance packages won't cover lost revenue or the recovery costs will be limited. So running through those scenarios and trying to understand what a significant event would look like will help you also be sure that you know, you're getting what you expect when you purchase the insurance.
And I think that's we're just about out of time. We've got our contact information there. Feel free to reach out.